If you search something like what vitamin D level prevents cancer, you probably expected me to give you a number, something clean, something you could screenshot, tape to your fridge, and chase with supplements until you hit it. I'm going to be straight with you right at the top. That number doesn't exist. Not because nobody's looked. Thousands of researchers have spent decades on this exact question, but because the actual science is messier, more interesting, and honestly more useful than any single number could ever be. So here's what this video actually is. I dug through the research from the National Cancer Institute, the NIH's Office of Dietary Supplements, and multiple peer-reviewed meta-analyses to answer the real question underneath that title. Does vitamin D affect your cancer risk? And if so, what does the evidence actually support you doing about it? Not the SEO-optimized version. Not the supplement company version. The version where I tell you when the evidence is strong, when it's shaky, and when scientists are still arguing with each other. I'm not a doctor. I'm a researcher and content creator who reads primary sources for a living, so you don't have to wade through 40 PDFs to get a straight answer. Nothing in this video replaces talking to your own physician, especially if you're on any medication. And I'll explain exactly why that caveat matters later, because it's not just a throwaway disclaimer. Let's get into it. Vitamin D isn't really a vitamin in the classic sense. It behaves more like a hormone. Your body makes it in your skin when sunlight hits it, and you can also get it from a handful of foods and from supplements. Once it's absorbed or produced, your liver and kidneys convert it into its active form, which then interacts with receptors found in almost every tissue in your body, not just bone. That last part is what got cancer researchers curious in the first place. Decades ago, epidemiologists noticed something odd on a map. People living in southern, sunnier latitudes seem to develop and die from certain cancers less often than people living farther north, where sunlight, and by extension, natural vitamin D production, is weaker for much of the year. That observation is what actually kicked off this entire field of research, dating back to work first proposed around 1980. From there, laboratory studies took over. Researchers exposed cancer cells and rodent tumors to vitamin D's active form and watched what happened. And what happened was genuinely interesting. Vitamin D appeared to slow the growth of cancer cells, encourage abnormal cells to mature into more normal ones, promote a process called apoptosis, which is essentially a cell's programmed self-destruct sequence, and reduce the blood vessel growth that tumors rely on to expand. It also seemed to interfere with a type of immune cell that normally keeps the immune system from attacking cancer aggressively. I want to pause on something important here. All of that is laboratory and animal-level evidence. It tells us vitamin D is biologically plausible as a cancer-fighting compound. It does not by itself tell us that raising your blood level will lower your personal cancer risk. Biology in a petri dish and biology in a human body eating, sleeping, aging, and living a life are not the same thing. And a huge amount of the confusion around vitamin D and cancer comes from people skipping that distinction. So researchers moved to actual humans, using two very different types of studies. Understanding the difference between these two is honestly the single most useful thing you'll take from this video, so bear with me. Observational studies follow large groups of people over time, measure their vitamin D blood levels, and then see who develops or dies from cancer years later. These studies are enormous, sometimes involving hundreds of thousands of people, and they're great at spotting patterns. Their weakness is that they can't fully separate cause from coincidence. People with higher vitamin D levels tend to also be more physically active, spend more time outdoors, eat differently, and have different underlying health statuses. any of those things could be the real driver of lower cancer risk, with vitamin D just riding along as an innocent bystander. Randomized controlled trials, or RCTs, solve that problem by randomly assigning some people to take vitamin D supplements and others to take a placebo, then comparing outcomes. Because the assignment is random, the two groups should be similar in every other way, which makes it much easier to credit EA or not credit I, the vitamin D itself. The trade-off is that these trials usually test one fixed dose in people who already have fairly normal vitamin D levels, which is a very different setup from the observational studies comparing naturally high versus naturally low levels across a whole population. Keep that framework in your head, because the observational studies and the randomized trials on vitamin D and cancer don't always agree, and understanding why is the key to this whole topic. According to the National Cancer Institute's own summary of this research, the picture is far from uniform across cancer types. This is the part almost every clickbait video skips, and it's the most important nuance in the entire topic. Higher vitamin D levels have been fairly consistently linked to lower rates of colorectal cancer, based on large pooled analyses combining data across multiple cohort studies. There's also a somewhat weaker link to lower bladder cancer risk. For breast cancer and lung cancer, multiple large studies, including big pooling projects that combine data across more than a dozen cohorts, found no consistent association at all between vitamin D levels and risk. That surprises people, because breast cancer is often the cancer people mention first when they bring up vitamin D. But the data on that specific link is not there in the way popular wellness content suggests. And then there's the part that really undercuts the just take more vitamin D narrative. For prostate cancer and possibly pancreatic cancer, some large studies have found the opposite relationship. Higher circulating vitamin D levels associated with somewhat higher risk, not lower. Researchers are still trying to understand why, but it's a real signal that shows up across more than one data set. And it's exactly why nobody serious in this field says, more vitamin D equals less cancer, full stop. When researchers instead look at cancer mortality, meaning, do people with lower vitamin D die from cancer, any cancer, more often than people with higher levels, the picture shifts again. A meta-analysis combining 12 cohort studies found that people with the lowest vitamin D levels had a moderately higher rate of cancer death than those with the highest levels. The difference was reported at roughly 14%. Separately, an analysis of around 4,000 cancer cases drawn from a major U.S. cancer screening trial found that people in the highest vitamin D category had a roughly 17% lower cancer mortality rate compared to those in the lowest category. Two independent analyses using different study populations pointing in the same general direction on mortality specifically. That's a reasonably consistent signal. But notice what it is and isn't. It's an association between blood levels and death rates in observational data, not proof that raising your level with a pill will lower your personal risk of dying from cancer. That's exactly the gap randomized trials are designed to close. This is where the story gets genuinely humbling, and where I think you deserve the most honesty. The largest and most rigorous test of this question is a trial called VITAL, published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Researchers assigned more than 25,000 adults, men 50 and older, women 55 and older, to take either 2,000 IU of vitamin D3 daily, alongside fish oil in a separate part of the study design, or a placebo, and followed them for about 5 years. The result? The vitamin D group had essentially the same overall cancer incidence as the placebo group. Breast, prostate, and colorectal cancer rates specifically were also statistically the same between groups. Vitamin D did not reduce cancer deaths overall in the main analysis either, though in an additional analysis that excluded the first couple of years of follow-up. The reasoning being that cancers diagnosed very early in a trial were probably already developing before supplementation started. There was a suggested reduction in cancer mortality. That's a secondary exploratory finding, not the trial's headline result, so it should be read as suggestive rather than settled. A separate large trial in New Zealand called VIDA tested a monthly high dose of vitamin D in adults aged 50 to 84 and also found no reduction in overall cancer risk. And an Australian trial called D-Health, using a monthly dose of 60,000 IU for 5 years in adults 60 and older, likewise found no reduction in cancer mortality. Going back further, one of the earliest large trials, the Women's Health Initiative, tested a lower dose, 400 RIU vitamin D plus calcium, in postmenopausal women and found no effect on breast or colorectal cancer incidence either. So across the board, when you take healthy or fairly healthy older adults, many of whom already had adequate vitamin D levels going in and give them a supplement, the trials have not shown a drop in the chance of developing cancer. Now here's the nuance that matters, and where a well-designed meta-analysis becomes genuinely useful. When researchers pooled data from 10 randomized controlled trials through 2018, including VITAL, they found that vitamin D supplementation was associated with a modest reduction in cancer mortality, around 13%, even though it didn't reduce how many people developed cancer in the first place. In other words, across these combined trials, vitamin D didn't clearly stop cancer from occurring, but there's a signal, muted and not universally replicated, that it might help some people survive it once it does. I want to be very precise about what that 13% figure is, because this is exactly the kind of number content creators love to inflate. It's from a meta-analysis of trial data through 2018. It is not a guarantee. It's a pooled statistical association across studies that didn't all use identical doses, populations, or durations. A separate trial-based analysis of colorectal cancer patients specifically has looked at whether vitamin D supplementation improves survival after diagnosis, and results there have varied depending on the study. If you're thinking, wait, the population studies show a stronger benefit than the actual experiments, you're reading this correctly, and researchers have a working theory about why. Most people enrolled in these big randomized trials already had blood vitamin D levels considered adequate for general health before the trial even started. If vitamin D mainly matters for people who are actually low, then testing it in people who are already sufficient is a bit like testing whether more sleep helps someone who already sleeps 8 hours a night. You might not see much of an effect because the group wasn't deficient to begin with. This is a real, actively studied hypothesis in the field, not something I'm speculating to make the story tidier. Researchers have explicitly proposed that any cancer-related benefit of supplementation might be concentrated in people who start out with low or deficient levels, and that this needs to be tested directly in trials designed around deficient populations with longer follow-up. That research is ongoing, and as of now, it hasn't produced a definitive answer. So where does that leave us on the title of this video? Here's the honest summary. There is no single scientifically validated vitamin D blood level that has been proven in a randomized trial to prevent cancer. What does exist is a consistent observational association between low vitamin D and higher cancer mortality, a mixed to modest signal from trial meta-analyses on mortality, but not incidence. A real and well-documented downside if you push your levels too high, and very different relationships depending on which type of cancer you're talking about. That's a much more useful, if less punchy, answer than a single magic number. Before I get into what the actual reference ranges are and what you might reasonably discuss with your doctor, quick gut check for you. Drop it in the comments. Do you actually know your last tested vitamin D level in nanograms per milliliter or nanomoles per liter? Not a guess. An actual test result. I genuinely bet most people watching this have never had it tested, or got tested once years ago and forgot the number. That's useful information for you to know before you take any of the recommendations in the second half of this video. So if you don't know your number, that's actually the single most useful action step from this whole video. More useful than anything I'm about to tell you about optimal ranges. All right, back to it. Vitamin D status is measured through a blood test for something called 25-hydroxyvitamin D, usually shortened to 25-OHD. Results come back in one of two units, nanograms per milliliter or nanomoles per liter. If you ever need to convert, a nanogram per milliliter is roughly 2.5 times a nanomole per liter. According to the NIH's Office of Dietary Supplements, based on recommendations from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, the standard categories look like this. Below about 12 nanograms per milliliter, 30 nanomoles per liter, is considered deficient. Between roughly 12 and 20 nanograms per milliliter is a gray zone where some people may be at risk of inadequacy. At 20 nanograms per milliliter, 50 nanomoles per liter, and above, levels are considered adequate for the vast majority of the population. The review committee behind these numbers designed that threshold to cover the needs of about 97.5% of people, and above roughly 50 nanograms per milliliter, 125 nanomoles per liter, levels are considered too high and potentially associated with problems. Now here's where I have to flag genuine disagreement in the field, because pretending it doesn't exist would be dishonest. The Endocrine Society, a separate professional medical organization, uses different thresholds. They define deficiency as below 20 nanograms per milliliter and actually recommend a preferred range as high as 40 to 60 nanograms per milliliter for some patients, notably higher than the general population adequate cutoff used by the NIH's own reference source. That range of 40 to 60 nanograms per milliliter also shows up in some cancer-specific observational research, including one older, frequently cited ecological analysis that projected substantial reductions in breast and colorectal cancer cases if the population's average level were raised into that zone. But I want to flag clearly, that particular projection is based on combining observational data with a single randomized trial, not on new randomized evidence proving that outcome. It's a modeled estimate, not a confirmed result. A more recent 2024 review focused specifically on breast cancer also calculated an estimated protective threshold in a similar range. But that review is explicitly framed as an estimate synthesized from existing studies, not a new clinical trial, and its authors describe it as requiring more research before being treated as a target. So you have two professional bodies with two different adequate thresholds, and cancer-specific researchers pointing toward a higher range still, all working from data that doesn't fully agree because they're measuring different things: bone health versus population cancer statistics versus individual randomized outcomes. This is a real, active scientific disagreement, not a case where I'm hiding a clear consensus answer from you. Here's something that genuinely surprised me when I dug into the NIH's health professional level fact sheet, and it's the exact opposite of what most vitamin D content implies. The expert committee that reviews vitamin D safety has specifically warned that serum levels above roughly 50 to 60 nanograms per milliliter should generally be avoided because emerging evidence, including national survey data, observational studies, and some clinical trial data, suggests that even levels somewhat below that ceiling, roughly in the 30 to 48 nanograms per milliliter range, have been associated in some analyses with increased all-cause mortality, greater risk of cancer at some specific sites, including the pancreas, more cardiovascular events, and more falls and fractures in elderly populations. This lines up with something researchers call a J-shaped or U-shaped curve. Risk is elevated when vitamin D is too low, appears lowest somewhere in a middle range, and then appears to tick back upward again at very high levels. One large population-based analysis of medical records covering more than 1 million people found the lowest combined risk of mortality and cardiovascular events in a range of roughly 20 to 36 nanograms per milliliter, with risk increasing at levels both below and above that band. I want to be careful here too. This J-curve pattern comes primarily from observational data, and some researchers in the field have specifically argued these conclusions deserve reevaluation, since very high vitamin D levels in real populations often show up alongside other risk factors, similar to the reverse causation problem I described earlier. So I'm not telling you high vitamin D definitely causes harm. I'm telling you that more is better is not a scientifically supported strategy either, and multiple independent sources converge on caution around pushing levels much past the 50 to 60 nanograms per milliliter mark without medical supervision. The practical takeaway: megadosing vitamin D on your own, hoping to cancer-proof yourself by chasing the highest number you can hit, is not supported by the evidence and could plausibly backfire. This is a case where the responsible, boring answer really is the correct one. Let's bring this all the way back down to something usable, because I don't want to leave you with 40 minutes of nuance and no next step. Get an actual blood test rather than guessing. This is genuinely the single highest value action here. You cannot know whether you're deficient, adequate, or in some higher target range without measuring it. Guessing based on how much sun you get, or assuming a multivitamin covers you, isn't reliable. Talk to your doctor about what target range makes sense for you, specifically. Given that professional organizations don't fully agree, and given that your personal risk factors, skin tone, geography, age, existing health conditions, and family cancer history all affect what's reasonable for you, this is not a one-size-fits-all number, and it's not something a YouTube video should be prescribing to you individually. If you're deficient, correcting that deficiency has well-established general health benefits. For bone health in particular, this is settled science, not controversial. Whether correcting a deficiency also meaningfully changes your personal cancer risk is the part that remains genuinely uncertain based on current trial evidence, but there's no real downside to fixing an actual confirmed deficiency under medical guidance. If you're already in the adequate range, the current trial evidence does not support taking megadoses hoping for extra cancer protection. The randomized trials that tested this in people with generally adequate starting levels didn't find a reduction in cancer incidence, and pushing levels too high carries its own documented risks. Food sources exist if you'd rather get there without pills for now, Fatty fish like salmon, trout, tuna, and mackerel are naturally rich in vitamin D3, along with fish liver oil, egg yolks, and some fortified foods like milk and cereal in many countries. Food alone often isn't enough to correct a real deficiency, which is exactly why this is a conversation to have with a doctor rather than a project to run entirely on nutrition labels. And this is the disclaimer I promised to come back to. If you're on medication for blood pressure, heart conditions, or really any chronic condition, please loop your doctor in before starting or changing vitamin D supplementation and before making any significant sun exposure changes. Vitamin D affects calcium metabolism, and calcium interacts with a surprising number of medications and existing conditions, kidney issues, and certain heart medications in particular. This isn't a throwaway line at the end of a script. It's a genuinely relevant interaction that your doctor needs to know about, because natural and risk-free are not the same thing, especially at high supplemental doses. None of this, nothing in this entire video, is a substitute for your doctor's advice, a diagnosis, or a treatment plan. If you or someone you love is dealing with an active cancer diagnosis, please treat information like this as background context for a conversation with your oncology team, not as a standalone protocol. If you came into this video hoping for a single dramatic number, I get it, and I'm sorry the honest answer is messier than that. But I'd rather give you the real sourced, sometimes contradictory picture than a fake certainty that falls apart the moment you actually read the studies behind it. The truthful version of this story is still genuinely worth knowing. Vitamin D deficiency is common, it's easy to test for, correcting a real deficiency has clear general health value, and the cancer-specific picture is promising enough to take seriously without being settled enough to oversell. If this kind of "let's actually check what the research says" breakdown is useful to you, let me know in the comments what health claim you want me to fact check next. I'll do the same deep dive, same rules, same honesty about what's proven versus what's still being studied. Thanks for watching, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.